Show me the evidence. Show me the data. This is what you are likely to hear from an economist from the Chicago School of Thought, or most economists in the neoclassical era, as the approach to economics from the standpoint of the Chicago School of Economic Thinking has become very ubiquitous. Now, I should define what the Chicago School of Economic Thinking is. It is a neoclassical thinking that sees economics as the study of the allocation of scarce resources which have alternative uses. The very definition that this school posits has very significant implications in regards to the approach they take, as aforementioned, to which I shall get into as we go along. The school was founded by Frank Knight, Jacob Weiner, Henry Simon, Aaron Director, as well as Theodore Schultz in the 1930s. This school, as it stands, can be separated into three generations thus far: the old generation, the second, as well as the third. The contributions made by the old generations are on the role of the incentives as well as the complexity of events, as opposed to studying just the general equilibrium. This point is what Jonathan Needham takes economics to task on the issue of the general equilibrium, as we have seen in the course of the history of economic thought. The older generation, through Salz, contributed to the works of agricultural economists as well as human capital theory and economic development. Now, from the second generation, we have one of the most famous economists, Milton Friedman. He contributed with his work on the quantitative theory of money, among many other contributions, to which I shall get into as we go along. Another renowned economist was George Stigler, who posited on the work of regulatory theory. That is, regulatory bodies have a proclivity to go beyond their intended mission and use coercive powers to establish their own self-benefits. Now, living in South Africa, this is nothing new, as we have seen regulatory bodies that have been established to vastly facilitate private gain of an elite few. Stigler also wrote on the problem of the Negro, stating that the problem of the black community is misguided leadership, lack of education, and a lackluster work ethic. I should also note that Stigler wrote extensively on the history of economic thought. The second generation also had James M. Buchanan, who wrote on price theory, as well as Ronald Coase, who was not the graduate student to Frank Knight, but was heavily influenced by Knight's work. The third generation had Gary Becker, who I shall elaborate on in another video. There was also Eugene Farmer, who posited on the work of the efficient market hypothesis, a concept which is embedded in rational expectations of agents. Now, from what we can see thus far, is that the Chicago School of Thought is carrying on with the early works of philosophers that we have seen in the course, such as the positivists Auguste Comte, as well as the rationalists in Jeremy Bentham. In my presentation of the Chicago School of Thought, I would like to contrast it with other famous economic schools of thinking, such as the Marxist school, which believes in government control, the Keynesians, who believe in government intervention, especially through economic downturns, as well as the Chicago School of Thought, who believes in a minimalist government approach, and the government approach should be only be facilitated through monetary policy, and the Austrian economists who believe in no government intervention. A laissez-faire approach the French philosophers such as Francois Roussel would like. To take the Great Depression, for example, the different perspectives that manifest from the schools of economic thought as a consequence of the different approaches. We see that Milton Friedman posits that the Great Depression could have been avoided if the government at the time printed more money, whilst and thus even after the crash, the best course of action from the Chicagoan standpoint is a monetary expansion as opposed to a physical expansion that would be asserted by the Keynesian school of economics, to which has been elaborated on by in another video by my colleague. The Austrians posited in their theory of the business cycle that what leads to bursts in the markets are expansionary credit. As we can see in the same event, we have three different perspectives. One is that the Chicago School of Thought believes in monetary expansion. The Keynesian school of thought believes in physical expansion, i.e., government spending. The Austrian economists believe in no government intervention whatsoever, and the market will take care of itself. Now, to take a closer look to the approach, we see that how the Chicagoans define economics as the study of the allocation of scarce resource of the allocation of scarce resources which have alternative uses, implies that the study or the concept of economics becomes statistically and or mathematically rigorous, as the focal point of the study is not people but resources. Thus, an accumulation of data can be compiled in this framework. Ultimately, this makes economics closer to a science, while the Austrians see economics more as a social science rather than a hard science, as they tend to advance their arguments a priori using reason from first principles. The difference in the two schools is manifest in how they see prices, because the Chicagoans believe that prices are determined by the production cost and or growth of the money supply, as is posited by Friedman. The Austrians view prices as being determined by the subjective laws of demand and of the laws of supply. Lawrence Miller Jr. writes on the Chicago School of Thought of Economics in its assertions with regards to a minimalist government approach, as aforementioned in the presentation, and a free market capitalist mode of production, as has been asserted by Mill and Locke before. To conclude on the Chicago School of Economics, I would sum it up as an approach to economics that is empirical in its quantitative methods, that uses mathematical models. The Chicagoans have a neoclassical approach to prices as being determined by the production costs, as opposed to the Austrians, for example, that believe in a priori approach that is a causal realist approach that takes into account the role of human action in time. The Chicagoans believe in free markets and they are against most regulation. They utterly oppose socialism. They concede to the knowledge problem, notwithstanding their positivist approach. The imperialism of economics is also present in their works, as is seen from Gary Becker, Ronald Coase, and others. With that being said, I thank you.